Hello, welcome to Brush and Pencil, where today you get to watch me make a horrific mistake. See, I have been going through old paintings looking for sketches that never got colored out, and I found this fantastic set of lungs that I had never finished. I do teach a lot of anatomy based drawing in watercolor, and I thought this is the perfect project. However, I had had this sketch lying around long enough that I had clearly forgotten what kind of paper I actually sketched this on, and today's video is basically going to be a lesson on watercolor is meant for watercolor paper. You can see with these first strokes how awful this application is going. I got to here and realized, well, this is going to be a hot mess, but I pushed through. I'm like, you know what? At the very least, I could probably use this as a how not to paint sort of tutorial, which is exactly what this had to turn into. I tried here to do a wet in wet technique by wetting the paper first to see if I could get the paint to flow more, which it doesn't even a little bit. It's absorbing so fast into this paper that it just can't help but leave behind almost every brushstroke that I make onto this paper. Now, it is normal for watercolor to dry paler, but that's actually not what we see happening here on this paper because this is not dry in any sense. This paint is absorbing so fast into the interior of the paper that it is mellowing out in a really awful way. It's almost changing this red, which is a cool red, to sort of a purple tone, which is awful looking. I tried on this second lung to use a lot more water to give myself more time to manipulate the color, which worked for about 3 seconds on top and then stopped working because of all the little branches of the bronchioli going into the lung tissue. And you can see where I tried to saturate the pigment more to help with the coloring, but even that really was not helpful at all, and it just made the lung tissue mismatch. So really, that was its own unique mistake as well. As I painted this, I couldn't for the life of me remember at all what type of paper this is. It's very textured, which was why I did assume that it was watercolor. Watercolor paper has a lot more texture to it than something made for markers or multimedia. Now it does do better here where I am painting the cartilage that lines the larynx and trachea in blue. I chose this color just to have something kind of saturated and primary so that the entire drawing wasn't just shades of reds and pinks like natural body tissue generally is. Because it's a much smaller area and I have prepped this round of paint to be much more heavily saturated with pigment, it's painting a little better, but you can see as it dries at the top as I work my way down, it's still desaturating as it absorbs into that paper too much. This whole process actually brought back horrible memories of like childhood watercolor. You know, when you get the Crayola watercolor set and that silly book that looks like a coloring book but is sold with the watercolor paint. And the intention is that you can watercolor in the book. You can't. The paper dissolves. It's a hot mess. I actually thought that I really disliked watercolors as a kid because of that process, because that's what my watercolor materials were as a young child. Actually, it took me till almost adulthood to pick up watercolors again because of that. And this is really reminding me of that process. The overall really important thing here, and that I tell this to my students all the time, you can learn a lot of skill sets with cheap paint and good paper, but it doesn't work the other way around. Expensive paint and bad paper is a bad time. So if you take one thing away from this video, it is invest in your watercolor paper. Now here's that painting dry after I had added a couple more colors of paint to the various parts, and you can see the bending in the paper where it's warping, and I have a picture of that from the side. The water absorbs into the paper, it stretches the fibers, and then it will dry not flat. And you can look at this and say, well, that's not that bad, but this is after this paper had sat for 4 days under a bunch of heavy books to see if I could get it to flatten out more. So actually not a good time. And even from the back, you can see through the paper and see all this warping Any more water and paint on this stuff, I think it may have actually started to develop holes like tissue paper. So yeah, make sure you use watercolor paper for your watercolor projects. See you next time.